My name is Kendra. I am 33 years old, and on New Year's Eve, my own mother looked me dead in the eye and called me a burden. My brother laughed, boasting that at least he made the family proud, while my sister-in-law smirked at my supposed financial illiteracy. I put down my fork, stood up, and left my childhood home without shedding a single tear. 4 weeks later, my father called me in a panic, asking why their mortgage was unpaid and why the bank was threatening foreclosure. I simply told him to ask his pride and joy for the money before hanging up. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to walk away from toxic family members who constantly underestimated your true worth. Growing up in Westchester County, New York, meant living behind a facade of relentless perfection. My parents, Richard and Beatrice, valued their social standing above all else. Our sprawling mansion, with its manicured hedges and towering oak trees, was a monument to their obsession with appearances. Inside, however, the emotional temperature was always freezing. I was the family scapegoat, the disappointment who refused to play their pretentious games. They thought I was a glorified technical support worker barely scraping by in a rented apartment. They had absolutely no idea that I was the founder and chief executive officer of a highly lucrative logistics software startup. I kept my wealth entirely hidden because I knew exactly how my family operated. They viewed money as a weapon, and I refused to hand them ammunition. The holiday dinner was supposed to be a standard family obligation. I arrived at the estate wearing a simple but tailored wool coat, deliberately leaving my actual luxury vehicle at my office garage and driving an older, reliable vehicle. The dining room was suffocatingly lavish. Beatrice had hired a private chef to prepare a 5-course meal, and the table was covered in crystal glasses, imported linens, and heavy silver cutlery. The air smelled of roasted duck and expensive perfume. I sat quietly at the end of the table, enduring the usual barrage of passive-aggressive remarks. When it was time to exchange gifts, the atmosphere grew incredibly tense. Beatrice handed my brother Cameron a beautifully wrapped box containing a vintage watch. She handed my sister-in-law Jasmine a velvet jewelry case. Then she turned to me. She did not hand me a wrapped box. Instead, she slid a plain white envelope across the polished mahogany table. It stopped right in front of my plate. I opened it to find a cheap, generic $500 prepaid gift card. "Use this for your rent." "Kendra," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy that was meant entirely for the benefit of the hired staff hovering in the hallway. 33 years old, still renting, playing around with computers. "You have always been such a burden on our minds. We just want you to settle down and find a real career so we can stop worrying about you." I stared at the plastic card. A burden. The word hung in the air, heavy and sharp. I had spent my entire 20s building a multi-million-dollar software empire from scratch, working 80-hour weeks, securing massive corporate contracts, and employing over 50 people in Manhattan. Yet to the woman sitting at the head of the table, I was nothing more than a pathetic charity case who needed pity. Cameron swirled the deep red liquid in his wine glass. It was a $200 bottle of wine paid for by the very credit cards I suspected were completely exhausted. He leaned back in his chair, flashing that charismatic, arrogant smile that had fooled my parents for decades. Cameron played the role of a hotshot venture capitalist, but I knew his investments were little more than reckless gambles on cryptocurrency and risky stocks. He wore a designer suit that looked brand new, projecting an image of unlimited wealth that I knew deep down was completely fabricated. "At least I make this family proud," Cameron chuckled, taking a slow sip of his drink. "My latest financial flip just paid for Jasmine's new car. You should try getting into real finance, Kendra. Maybe then Mom and Dad would not have to worry about you ending up on the street." Jasmine sat next to him, adjusting the diamond bracelet around her wrist. As a luxury real estate agent, Jasmine was brilliant, fiercely ambitious, and deeply obsessed with maintaining the image of elite success. As a successful African-American woman, navigating high society circles, she placed immense value on projecting absolute perfection. She married Cameron because she believed he was the epitome of generational wealth, the perfect power couple narrative she wanted to present to the world. She had no idea she was married to a financial sinking ship. Jasmine gave me a long, condescending look, her eyes scanning my unbranded outfit with clear disdain. Financial literacy is not for everyone, sweetie, she said smoothly, her tone perfectly matching my mother's cruelty. It takes a certain kind of intellect to navigate the market. No wonder men are intimidated by your mess. You cannot even manage your own life, let alone build a proper portfolio. The sheer audacity of their performance was almost cinematic. They sat there swimming in a sea of toxic arrogance, lecturing a millionaire on financial literacy. For years, I would have lowered my head and absorbed the insults just to keep the peace. I would have internalized the pain and suffered in silence during the long drive back to the city. But tonight was different. Tonight, the final thread of my familial loyalty snapped completely. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice or defend my career. I simply picked up my silver fork and placed it down on the porcelain plate with a sharp, resonant sound. The noise cut through the smug silence of the dining room. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I looked directly into my mother's eyes, seeing the sudden flicker of confusion behind her perfect makeup. A burden, I said, my voice dangerously calm and steady. Let us see how light you feel without me. I turned my back on the lavish spread, the crystal glasses, the false concern, and the toxic people who shared my genetics. I grabbed my coat from the foyer and walked out the heavy front doors, stepping into the freezing snow-covered driveway, leaving them to their desperate delusions of grandeur. The biting winter wind whipped across my face as I marched down the sweeping brick pathway of my parents' estate. The snow was falling heavily now, coating the manicured lawns in a thick blanket of freezing white. I pulled my wool coat tighter around my shoulders, my breath forming visible clouds in the freezing night air. Every single step away from that toxic dining room felt like a massive physical weight lifting from my chest. I reached my vehicle, a reliable and unassuming machine that I had secretly customized with top-tier security and technology features on the inside. I unlocked the doors and climbed into the driver's seat, desperate to turn on the heat and put as much distance as possible between myself and Westchester County. Before I could even start the engine, the heavy oak front door of the mansion burst completely open. My father Richard stormed out into the violent blizzard. He was not wearing a winter coat over his expensive tailored suit, and his face was flushed a deep, angry red. He marched down the long driveway, his dress shoes slipping slightly on the fresh snow, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He reached my vehicle and slammed his hand against the driver's side window, the loud thud startling me in the quiet isolation of the car. "Do not you walk away when your mother is trying to help you!" Richard shouted, his voice muffled by the thick glass, but still dripping with absolute authority and rage. He pounded on the window again, demanding my total submission. "Roll this down right now. You are acting like a spoiled child. You are just jealous of your brother and his success." I stared at him through the glass. For a fleeting second, I saw the man who was supposed to protect me. The man who was supposed to be my guiding father. But all I really saw was an arrogant, image-obsessed tyrant who could not stand losing control over his designated punching bag. I pressed the button, and the window glided down smoothly, letting the freezing winter wind howl into the warm cabin of my car. "Jealous?" I asked, my voice cutting through the wind like a newly sharpened blade. "You honestly think I am jealous of Cameron? He is successful!" Richard spat back, gripping the edge of the window frame to stabilize himself in the snow. "He is building wealth. He is taking care of his wife. Meanwhile, you sit there pouting because your mother gave you a necessary reality check. You have always resented him for being the smart one in this family." I let out a harsh, humorless laugh that caught him entirely off guard. The sheer hypocrisy of his statement demanded to be torn apart right then and there. I was completely done protecting their fragile egos. I was finished keeping the peace at the expense of my own sanity and self-worth. "Let us talk about Cameron and his brilliant financial mind, Richard," I said, dropping the title of Dad entirely. The use of his first name made him flinch physically. Do you remember my college fund? The $80,000 that grandmother left specifically for my education? The money you forced me to sign over to Cameron when I was 18 because he needed seed money for his revolutionary startup. Richard tightened his jaw, and he looked away for a fraction of a second. That was a family investment, he muttered defensively, refusing to meet my eyes. We were trying to build a lasting legacy for everyone. It was a complete scam, I shot back, my voice rising above the howling wind. He took my entire future and blew it on a business that went bankrupt in exactly 3 months. He spent my tuition money on luxury car leases and extravagant parties to pretend he was a prodigy. I had to work 3 jobs, take out massive student loans, and sleep in the university library just to get my degree. I built my life from absolute zero because you chose to fund his delusions instead of my education. I am not jealous, Richard. I am exhausted. I am exhausted from watching you pretend he is a genius while you treat me like trash. The truth hit him hard, but instead of reflection, it only fueled his narcissistic rage. His knuckles turned white as he gripped my car door. He could not handle being confronted with his own colossal failures as a parent. He needed me to remain the villain in their perfectly curated family narrative to justify their terrible choices. "You are a bitter, ungrateful wretch!" Richard growled, his face leaning in close to the window, his breath smelling of expensive wine and blind pride. "You think you can disrespect us in our own home? You think you can insult your brother like this? Never come back to this house. You are cut off forever. Do not call us when you finally hit rock bottom. You are dead to this family." Cut off from what I asked, softly staring at the pathetic man standing in the freezing snow. "You have never given me a single thing to begin with." Without waiting for his response, I rolled the window up, forcing him to step back quickly to avoid getting his fingers caught. I shifted the vehicle into drive and hit the gas pedal. The heavy tires gripped the snow, and I pulled out of the grand circular driveway, leaving Richard standing alone in the blizzard, a small, furious figure shrinking rapidly in my rearview mirror. The heater finally warmed the car as I navigated the winding, tree-lined roads, heading toward the highway that would take me back to Manhattan. The silence in the cabin was profound. I expected to feel devastated. I expected the familiar crushing weight of rejection to settle over my chest. Instead, I felt an exhilarating, intoxicating surge of pure freedom. The chains of obligation were gone. I no longer had to hide my success or shrink myself to make them comfortable. About 10 minutes onto the highway, the digital display on my dashboard lit up with an incoming call. The name on the screen read, David. David was my closest friend and a ruthless real estate and corporate attorney who handled all the complex legal maneuvers for my software company. I pressed the button on the steering wheel to answer. "Hey, David, Happy New Year," I said, my voice remarkably steady and calm. "Happy New Year, Kendra." David replied, his tone strictly business, bypassing any festive pleasantries. "Are you driving right now? Because you might want to pull over for this information." "I am fine. Tell me. Did you find anything?" Earlier that week, I had asked David to run a quiet background check on Cameron and my parents. Something about Cameron's extravagant spending and my parents' sudden, desperate need to show off had felt completely wrong. My logical brain had sensed a massive structural flaw in their financial facade. "I just ran the comprehensive background check you asked for," David said, his voice echoing clearly through the car speakers. "Kendra, it is so much worse than we initially thought. Your parents' house is currently in pre-foreclosure." I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my mind racing to process the information. Pre-foreclosure. How is that even mathematically possible? They paid off that entire mortgage over 10 years ago. "They did," David confirmed grimly. "But 18 months ago, someone took out a massive home equity line of credit against the property. They drained $800,000 from the house's equity. They have missed the last 4 consecutive payments. The bank has officially initiated the foreclosure process. Kendra, they are going to lose the estate in less than a month." A slow, cold realization washed over me as the puzzle pieces finally slammed together. The arrogant toasts, the desperate gifts, the forced projection of wealth. It was all a collapsing house of cards, and my golden child brother was holding the match. January 2nd arrived with the sharp, unforgiving clarity of a Manhattan winter morning. I stood at the head of a frosted glass conference table in my corner office on the 45th floor. Below me, the city moved like a well-oiled machine, much like the logistics software my company had spent the last 5 years perfecting. Across the table sat 3 senior executives from one of the largest global shipping conglomerates. They were not looking at a glorified technical support worker. They were looking at a woman about to close a $20 million enterprise licensing agreement. "You have a hemorrhage in your European distribution network," I told the lead executive, tapping the interactive display to bring up their projected quarterly losses. "Our proprietary algorithm stops the bleeding. It cuts your transit delays by 14% and reduces overhead by 8%. You sign this contract today, and that 20 million pays for itself by the third quarter." They were captivated. They were looking at me with the kind of respect my family had always reserved for Cameron. My mother had told me I was playing around with computers. Playing around with computers. The phrase echoed in my mind. Playing around with computers had built this company. Playing around with computers had bought this skyscraper office. Playing around with computers was about to secure my financial independence for the next 10 lifetimes. The executives did not see a burden. They saw a solution. Hands were shaken. Contracts were signed. The executives filed out of my office, leaving me alone with the quiet hum of the ventilation system and the breathtaking view of the New York skyline. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the sprawling metropolis. I had won. I had built my empire in complete silence, away from their constant criticism and crushing expectations. The heavy oak door of my office clicked shut, and I turned to see David walking in. He did not look celebratory. He did not have the champagne we usually opened after closing a major deal. Instead, he carried a thick, heavily tabbed legal folder. He bypassed the guest chairs and walked straight to my desk, dropping the file onto the polished surface. The heavy thud echoed in the large room, shattering the post pitch high. "We need to talk about Westchester," David said, his voice stripped of any professional warmth. He was in full crisis management mode. I walked over and opened the folder. The first page was a property deed, but it was buried under layers of bank notices, red-flagged financial statements, and aggressive legal warnings. "You asked how a paid-off $2 million estate ends up in pre-foreclosure," David continued, pacing the length of my office. "The answer is your brother. Cameron did not just have a few bad months in the market. He systematically dismantled your parents' entire financial safety net." I flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning the terrifying numbers. 18 months ago, Richard and Beatrice had signed authorization forms for a massive home equity line of credit. They leveraged their primary residence, their only real asset, to give Cameron liquid cash. He convinced them it was a bridge loan, David explained, pointing to a highlighted paragraph. He told them he was on the verge of closing a massive venture capital fund and just needed temporary liquidity to prove his collateral. He promised them a 20% return within 6 months. They believed him. They believed the golden child. The golden child. The son who could do no wrong. The son who made the family proud. The son who was currently driving them straight into absolute bankruptcy. I stared at the signatures on the agreement. Richard's bold, arrogant scrawl. Beatrice's elegant looping cursive. They had signed away their sanctuary, their precious status symbol, to fund Cameron's fake lifestyle. Every designer suit, every expensive bottle of wine, every luxury car lease for Jasmine had been paid for by the bricks and mortar of the house I grew up in. They had mortgaged their shelter to maintain his illusion. My mother had handed me a gift card for rent while sitting in a dining room she no longer legally owned. I closed the main folder, feeling a bizarre mix of disgust and vindication, so they let him drain the equity. I said, leaning back against the edge of my desk and crossing my arms over my chest, "It is incredibly stupid, but it is ultimately their own choice. If the bank forecloses, they will just have to downsize and finally face the reality of their poor decisions. It is certainly not illegal to be a terrible investor or a gullible parent." David stopped pacing. He stood dead still in the center of the room, looking at me with a grim, unwavering expression that sent a sudden chill down my spine. He reached over and pulled a separate, much thinner envelope from the back of the file pile. He slid it across the smooth surface of my desk until it rested inches from my hand. "It gets worse, Kendra," David said, his voice dropping to a low, serious register. "Cameron did not just convince them to take out the equity line. When he blew through that first 800,000, he became desperate. The cryptocurrency market crashed. His margin calls came due, and he needed more cash to keep up the charade." I picked up the thin white envelope and pulled out the single document hidden inside. It was a secondary loan agreement, a high-interest, predatory lending contract designed to destroy the borrower. David pointed a finger directly at the signature line at the bottom of the page. "Look closely at the date and the authorization," he instructed quietly. "It gets worse, Kendra. Cameron did not just convince them, he forged your father's signature on a secondary high-interest loan. They are going to lose the house in exactly 28 days. I stared at the blue ink on the secondary loan agreement. The loops and harsh angles were a sloppy imitation of Richard's signature. Cameron had not just made a bad investment. He had committed a serious felony. I traced the edge of the paper with my index finger, feeling the heavy, undeniable weight of the truth. My brother, the golden child, the financial genius who paid for luxury cars with imaginary money, was a criminal. He had leveraged our parents' home, drained their equity, and then when the well ran dry, he had stolen our father's identity to squeeze out the last remaining drops of their wealth. David stood perfectly still, watching me process the magnitude of the fraud. He knew me well enough to remain completely silent. I did not feel pity for my parents. They had handed Cameron the keys to their kingdom years ago. They had enabled his arrogance, funded his delusions, and mocked me for choosing hard work over their pretentious social games. Now, the ultimate bill was finally due. Before I could ask David about the legal ramifications of the forged document, my cell phone vibrated violently against the polished wood of my desk. The screen lit up, flashing a photograph of my mother, Beatrice. We had not spoken a single word to each other since the night I walked out of their mansion in a blizzard 4 weeks ago. I picked up the phone, pressed the speaker button, and set it back down so David could hear every single word. I answered with a flat, highly professional greeting. "Kendra, darling," Beatrice chirped. Her voice was aggressively bright, dripping with that artificial country club sweetness she reserved for charity luncheons and asking for favors. It was as if New Year's Eve had never happened, as if she had not handed me a prepaid gift card and called me a burden, as if Richard had not banished me from the family estate. "How are you, sweetie?" she continued, not waiting for me to respond. "I am just calling because we have a tiny little situation and we need your help. It is incredibly minor, really." I leaned back in my leather executive chair, making direct eye contact with David. "Define minor, Beatrice," I said, keeping my tone completely devoid of emotion. "Well," Beatrice sighed, adopting a tone of mild inconvenience. "Cameron is just having a tiny cash flow issue. He is in the middle of closing a massive merger with a huge technology firm, and his liquid assets are temporarily tied up in escrow. You know how high-level corporate finance works. It is all just moving money around. He needs a quick $50,000 personal loan to cover some immediate legal retainers until the merger pays out next week." I looked at the forged loan document sitting on my desk. The sheer audacity of her request was truly breathtaking. They were facing foreclosure in exactly 28 days. Cameron was actively committing identity theft, and she was calling the daughter she had literally thrown out into the snow to beg for $50,000. "He just needs a guarantor." Beatrice pushed her voice, tightening slightly, when I did not immediately agree. "Since your credit is not tied up in complex investments like his," the bank said, "your signature would push the approval through today. It is just a formality, Kendra. You will not have to pay a single cent. Cameron will have it cleared by Friday." "I am not guaranteeing a loan for Cameron," I said flatly. "I am not giving him $50,000. and I am certainly not attaching my name to his financial disasters. The silence on the line was instantaneous and incredibly heavy. The artificial sweetness vanished entirely, replaced immediately by the vicious toxic venom I had grown up with. I carried you for 9 months, Beatrice snapped, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical pitch. I gave you life, I fed you, I clothed you, and this is how you repay your family, by abandoning your own flesh and blood when they ask for a simple favor. You are just as selfish as you have always been. You are exactly as bitter and jealous as the day you refused to let Cameron use your car for his senior prom. I closed my eyes, marveling at her unique ability to weaponize history. The prom car. I had worked night shifts at a diner for 2 years to buy a used sedan for college. Cameron had demanded the keys because he wanted to impress a girl, and when I said no, my parents had grounded me for a month and called me greedy. He is your blood, Kendra, Beatrice screamed through the phone speaker. He is trying to save this family, and you are sitting in some cheap apartment, hoarding your little paycheck like a miser. You will guarantee this document, or I swear to you, I will make sure everyone in our circle knows exactly what kind of ungrateful, vindictive daughter you really are. You will sign the paper, Kendra. I reached forward and pressed the red button on the screen, cutting her off mid-sentence. The sudden silence in the office was deafening. I looked at the dark screen of my phone, then looked down at the forged signature on the high-interest loan agreement. The pieces aligned perfectly. They had no money. They had no credit. David watched me closely, his hands resting on the conference table. Should I call the bank's fraud department? He asked quietly. I can send the forged documents to their investigative team by noon. Warning the bank halts the foreclosure and triggers criminal indictments for your brother. I placed my hand flat over the file. I shook my head slowly, feeling a cold smile spread. Do not warn them, I told David, my voice echoing with authority. Set up a blind LLC. We are going to buy the house at the county auction. 2 days after I instructed David to form the blind LLC, the desperate tendrils of my family's collapsing empire reached directly into my daily routine. I was grabbing my morning espresso at an exclusive high-end coffee shop just 3 blocks from my corporate headquarters in Manhattan. The air inside smelled of roasted Brazilian beans and expensive leather. I was reviewing a digital briefing on my tablet when a shadow fell across my table. I looked up to see my sister-in-law, Jasmine. She looked like she had walked straight out of a luxury lifestyle magazine. Jasmine was dressed head to toe in pristine white Chanel, her tailored blazer draped perfectly over her shoulders. Her signature silk press was flawless, and a heavy gold Cartier watch clinked against her wrist as she pulled out the chair opposite me without asking for permission. Jasmine had always worked tirelessly to cultivate an image of absolute perfection. As a highly successful African-American luxury real estate agent, she thrived on selling the dream of generational wealth. She married Cameron because he fit perfectly into her carefully curated narrative of a power couple ascending the elite social ladder. She genuinely believed she had married into a dynasty, and she defended that illusion with ruthless precision. Hello, Kendra, Jasmine said, her voice smooth and polished, projecting the ultimate image of untouchable success. I set my tablet face down on the marble table. Jasmine, I said, matching her steady tone. You are quite far from your usual Westchester listings. To what do I owe this highly orchestrated ambush? She offered a tight, patronizing smile, refusing to break her immaculate character. She reached into her quilted designer handbag and pulled out a crisp trifold document. With manicured fingers, she slid the heavy paper across the table until it rested directly in front of my coffee cup. It was a formal loan guarantor application from a major commercial bank. We need to have a serious conversation about family obligations, Kendra, she said, leaning forward slightly, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper meant only for me. I know you resent Cameron's success. I know it must be difficult watching your older brother thrive in venture capital while you are still struggling to find your footing in technical support. But in our world, in the world of high-stakes finance and legacy building, we support each other. We do not let petty childhood jealousies dictate our financial decisions. I stared at the loan guarantor form. It was the exact same $50,000 trap Beatrice had tried to force on me over the phone. They had deployed Jasmine as their polished, intimidating closer, hoping her overwhelming aura of wealth would shame me into signing. Jasmine tapped her manicured fingernail against the signature line. "Sign the paper, Kendra," she instructed, her tone shifting from patronizing to softly commanding. "Do not embarrass the family name over a simple cash flow issue. Cameron is finalizing a massive corporate merger. His liquid capital is temporarily restricted in escrow accounts. You do not understand how high-stakes finance works, but I do. This loan is just a minor bridge, a basic formality. By refusing to sign this, you are jeopardizing a multi-million-dollar deal just to prove a pointless point." I looked at her perfectly applied makeup, noting the subtle tension in her jaw. Jasmine was sharp. She negotiated $10 million penthouses for breakfast. She had to know that a man managing a supposed multi-million-dollar merger would never need his estranged sister to co-sign a miserable $50,000 personal loan. But she was blinded by her desperate need to believe the lie. She had tied her entire identity, her brand, and her pride to Cameron's imaginary empire. If he failed, her flawless image fractured, and Jasmine would rather die than let society see her fail. "You are asking me to attach my legal name and my credit to Cameron's debt," I said, keeping my hands folded neatly in my lap. "You want me to risk my financial future for a man who bankrupted my college fund to buy a sports car he crashed 3 months later?" Jasmine sighed, an elegant sound of profound disappointment. "We are talking about right now, Kendra, not ancient history. Cameron is trying to elevate this family. He paid for my new Tesla in cash just last month. He is providing a lifestyle you cannot even begin to comprehend. We protect our own. If you walk away from this, you are proving your mother right. You are just a selfish burden dragging down his potential." I let her words hang in the air, absorbing the sheer arrogance of her delusion. She actually believed she was the superior force at this table. She believed I was a small, insignificant obstacle she could bulldoze with a Chanel suit and a few condescending buzzwords. I slowly reached out and placed my index finger on the center of the loan application. With a swift, fluid motion, I slid the paper straight back across the marble table. It stopped directly in front of her Cartier watch. "I am not signing your bridge loan, Jasmine," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, icy whisper. "And you might want to stop lecturing me about high-stakes finance when you clearly have no idea what is actually happening inside your own bank accounts." Jasmine stiffened, her perfect posture becoming dangerously rigid. "Excuse me," she snapped, the polished veneer cracking just a fraction. I leaned forward, mirroring her earlier posture, locking my eyes entirely onto hers. "You sit here flaunting that designer bag and bragging about a Tesla," I said smoothly. "But if Cameron is so incredibly rich, Jasmine, why did his credit card get declined at Nobu last night?" The silence that followed was absolute. The background noise of the bustling coffee shop seemed to vanish completely. Jasmine stared at me, her mouth parting slightly, the breath catching sharply in her throat. The confident, untouchable mask she wore so flawlessly did not just crack, it shattered entirely. "Oh," I said, tilting my head with a look of cold, manufactured sympathy. "You did not know." Jasmine's hands dropped below the table. Her eyes darted frantically as her brilliant mind tried to calculate the impossible mathematics of my statement. I stood up from my chair, grabbing my tablet, leaving my coffee untouched. I looked down at her terrified face, knowing that the seed of absolute destruction had just been firmly planted in her reality. I turned and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving her sitting alone with her unsigned paper and her collapsing world. 2 days later, the pristine illusion of the Westchester estate was shattered, not by a quiet phone call, but by the heavy, authoritative boots of a county sheriff's deputy. The morning was brutally cold, the kind of freezing temperature that made the manicured lawns look like brittle glass. The deputy parked his marked cruiser directly in the center of the circular driveway, ignoring the unspoken rules of my parents' exclusive neighborhood. He walked up the sweeping stone steps to the heavy mahogany front door. He did not knock. He did not ring the doorbell. He simply unrolled a thick, bright yellow document, raised a heavy-duty staple gun, and fired 4 loud metallic cracks into the expensive wood. The notice of public auction was officially posted. It was a glaring neon sign of financial ruin impossible to miss from the street. The bright yellow paper fluttered slightly in the harsh winter wind, a violent contrast to the subdued, tasteful aesthetic my mother had spent decades cultivating. Beatrice was just returning from her weekly country club brunch, pulling her immaculate Lexus SUV into the driveway. She stepped out, wrapping her designer cashmere coat tighter around her shoulders, completely oblivious to the neon yellow flag of surrender hanging on her front door. Then she saw it. She stopped dead in her tracks. Her perfectly manicured hands flew to her mouth. She recognized the ugly color of the paper instantly from the hushed, judgmental gossip circles at the club. It was the color of foreclosure. It was the color of total social annihilation. Beatrice let out a sound that was half gasp, half shriek. She rushed up the steps, her hands clawing desperately at the heavy staples, trying to rip the notice down before anyone could see. But the heavy cardstock held firm. A black luxury sedan drove past slowly. It was Mrs. Harrington, the neighborhood association president, and my mother's fiercest social rival. The passenger window rolled down, and Mrs. Harrington stared directly at the yellow notice, her eyes widening with undisguised gleeful shock. Beatrice collapsed onto the freezing stone porch, hyperventilating. A full-blown panic attack seized her. She sat on her own pristine front lawn, her designer coat trailing in the frost, gasping for air, as the reality of her impending poverty crashed down around her. The sound of my mother's hysterical sobbing, a loud and jagged noise cutting through the quiet suburban morning, brought Richard storming out of the house. He threw open the heavy mahogany door, nearly tearing the bright yellow notice in half with the violent force of his exit. His eyes rapidly scanned the dense legal text, his face instantly draining of deep color before flushing a dangerous apoplectic red. He did not kneel to comfort his weeping wife. Instead, he yanked his phone from his pocket and dialed Cameron's number, roaring into the receiver with a terrifying, unhinged rage that startled a flock of birds from the bare oak trees. Exactly 20 minutes later, a sleek silver Porsche screeched recklessly into the driveway, parking haphazardly over the frosted, meticulously manicured grass. Cameron scrambled out of the driver's seat. He was wearing a custom-tailored $3,000 suit, but his silk tie was askew, and despite the freezing winter temperature, thick beads of nervous sweat lined his forehead. He looked exactly like a desperate man who knew the walls were finally closing in. Richard lunged forward and grabbed him by the lapels of his expensive jacket, shoving him violently back against the hood of the luxury car. He pointed a trembling, furious finger at the bright yellow notice hanging on the front door. "You told me the loan was completely handled," Richard bellowed, his deep voice echoing across the silent, incredibly wealthy street. "You swore to me the bridge capital was secure. Explain this, Cameron. Explain how my house, my legacy, is going to a public auction in 26 days. Cameron held his hands up in a desperate gesture of surrender, his eyes darting frantically around the neighborhood, terrified of any observing neighbors. "Dad, please, you have to keep your voice down." Cameron pleaded, his usual charismatic charm completely cracking under the weight of absolute panic. "It is a bank error. It is just an automated system glitch. The massive escrow transfer from the corporate merger got unexpectedly delayed by an international compliance hold in Europe. The bank's automated software immediately triggered the foreclosure notice because the payment deadline shifted by a mere 48 hours. It means absolutely nothing in the grand scheme of things." Richard slowly released his grip, breathing heavily, his chest heaving with exertion. Beatrice pulled herself up from the freezing porch steps, grasping desperately at this pathetic lifeline of denial, a glitch she asked, her voice trembling with leftover hysteria. Cameron quickly smoothed his ruined lapels, forcing a confident, arrogant smile that completely failed to reach his terrified, shifting eyes. "Yes, Mom, it is just a minor glitch, But honestly, it is actually a massive blessing in disguise for our portfolio. My Wall Street partners are going to aggressively bid on the house at the county auction. They will buy it outright using untraceable corporate funds, and then they will seamlessly lease it back to us for absolute pennies on the dollar. It is a massive tax write-off for the firm, and you get to stay in the house indefinitely without paying a mortgage. No one in your social circle will ever know the deed officially changed hands. It is brilliant high-level financial maneuvering. My parents, absolutely desperate to protect their fragile social standing and their deeply ingrained superiority complex, swallowed the absurd, impossible lie whole. They essentially had to. The only other alternative was admitting to themselves and the world that they had been completely conned and financially ruined by their own golden son. Relief visibly washed over Beatrice's tear-stained face. Her public panic transformed instantly into a blinding, vindictive pride. She pulled her phone from her purse, her fingers flying aggressively across the screen. She opened the family group chat, a digital space I had remained silently anchored in for years, watching their endless self-congratulations. I was sitting at my desk, in my Manhattan corner office, reviewing the final complex structural details of the blind LLC David had just legally established for me. My phone buzzed on the polished wood surface. I glanced down at the bright screen. The message from Beatrice lit up the display. Cameron is saving the family estate through a brilliant corporate buyout. We are securing our legacy for the next generation. See Kendra. This is what a real child does. I read the vicious, arrogant words twice, letting the sheer magnitude of their delusion wash over me. I locked the phone screen and placed it face down. I looked out over the sprawling city skyline, a slow, predatory smirk spreading across my face. They were blindly marching toward the edge of a cliff, cheering for the very man who was pushing them over it. And I was going to own the land they landed on. 3 days later, a calendar invite materialized on my phone. The location attached was a rundown 24-hour diner on the absolute outer edge of the county line. The choice of venue was staggering. Richard and Beatrice Wilson did not do diners. They functioned exclusively within a rigid ecosystem of Michelin stars, private country club dining rooms, and exclusive valet parking. Sending me an invitation to a grease-stained booth off the interstate meant the financial noose was finally suffocating them. Their platinum credit cards were undoubtedly frozen. They were entirely out of cash. I arrived exactly on time, deliberately leaving my tailored executive blazer in my car and wearing a plain, unbranded gray sweater. I walked into the dimly lit diner. The air was heavy with the thick smell of cheap frying oil and stale coffee. I found my parents huddled in a cracked vinyl booth near the back, looking completely out of place. Richard wore a wrinkled suit jacket over a faded polo shirt, and Beatrice had hidden her unstyled hair beneath a wide silk scarf. They looked exhausted, paranoid, and remarkably aged. I slid into the booth across from them. Beatrice offered a tight, jittery smile that did absolutely nothing to hide the deep panic vibrating behind her eyes. "We just wanted something rustic tonight," she said, gesturing vaguely at the laminated menus coated in a thin film of sticky residue. "Sometimes those stuffy country club dinners just feel so pretentious. We wanted a grounded salt-of-the-earth family meeting to reconnect." I did not bother looking at the menu. I folded my hands on the chipped Formica tabletop. "Let us skip the rustic performance, Beatrice. Why am I here?" Richard cleared his throat, leaning forward heavily. He attempted to project his usual patriarchal authority, but the visible tremor in his hands completely betrayed him. "Cameron needs a temporary influx of capital," Richard stated, lowering his voice as a tired waitress carrying a pot of coffee walked past our booth. "He is assembling a ruthless legal team to fight the bank over this ridiculous auction misunderstanding. The lawyers require an immediate retainer to file the injunctions and stop the proceedings." I raised an eyebrow, maintaining a completely neutral expression. I thought Cameron was handling it. I thought his Wall Street partners were buying the estate and leasing it back to you. Why does he need a legal retainer if the bank glitch is already being resolved by his elite corporate friends? Beatrice shot Richard a panicked, desperate glance. "Corporate acquisitions take time, Kendra. She snapped her rustic persona, instantly vanishing to reveal the anxious woman beneath. There is bureaucratic red tape. We need to stall the county auction until his partners finalize the property transfer. Cameron has all his capital locked in escrow for the merger. He cannot liquidate his accounts without triggering massive financial penalties. And you want me to pay the retainer, I said flatly. Richard nodded, assuming his request was a royal decree. We know you have a retirement account through your little tech support job. A standard 401k or whatever package they offer entry-level employees. We need you to liquidate it immediately. The penalty for early withdrawal is irrelevant right now. You probably have, $30,000 in there by now. That sum will be exactly enough to cover the lead attorney's initial fee. The sheer delusion of their request was almost magnificent. They sat in a greasy diner because their golden child had completely bankrupted them, and they were demanding I sacrifice my hypothetical meager savings to fund his continued lies. They assumed my entire life's work amounted to $30,000, and they wanted to take it all without a single shred of hesitation or remorse. You want me to empty my retirement account? I said, pronouncing every single word with deliberate, agonizing clarity. You want me to bankrupt my future, destroy my only financial safety net, and hand you every dollar I have for a house you literally kicked me out of 4 weeks ago? We are your parents, Richard hissed, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson. We gave you absolutely everything. Cameron is on the verge of securing our family dynasty for the next century. You owe us this sacrifice. You are acting like a spoiled, ungrateful child who cannot see the bigger picture. There is no bigger picture, Richard, I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. There is no corporate merger. There are no Wall Street partners swooping in to save the estate. Cameron lied to you. He forged your signature on a predatory loan, drained the equity from your house, and lost every single penny feeding his fake venture capitalist persona. You are completely bankrupt, and your golden boy is a felon. Beatrice gasped loudly, clapping her hands over her ears as if my words were physical blows. Stop it! She shrieked, drawing the attention of several truck drivers sitting at the front counter. You are just jealous. You have always been insanely jealous of his sheer brilliance. Richard slammed his heavy fist onto the table, making the cheap silverware rattle loudly. He grabbed the edge of the table and stood up so violently that his knee caught the underside of the booth. A tall glass of ice water tipped over, spilling a freezing puddle directly into his lap. He did not even notice the water soaking through his trousers. He leaned over the table, his face inches from mine, his eyes burning with absolute unchecked hatred. You are dead to us, Richard growled, his voice trembling with furious rage. You are a bitter, pathetic disappointment. When Cameron fixes this, when he restores our legacy, you will never step foot on our property again. Do you hear me? You are permanently banished from that estate. I looked at the water dripping onto the floor. I looked at Beatrice weeping into her scarf. I smiled. I completely agree, Richard. The very next morning, miles away from that depressing diner, the consequences of Cameron's financial house of cards finally collapsed directly onto his wife. Jasmine sat behind her massive glass desk at her boutique luxury real estate agency in downtown Manhattan. She was meticulously reviewing the marketing collateral for a $12 million penthouse listing in Tribeca. Her office was a shrine to her carefully curated brand of success. Gold accents caught the morning light, abstract art hung on the pristine white walls, and a stack of prestigious business magazines featuring her agency sat perfectly aligned on the coffee table. She was the absolute picture of success, projecting wealth and stability to every high net worth client who walked through her double doors. Her intercom chimed softly. Jasmine pressed the glowing button, expecting her morning oat milk latte. Instead, the voice of her assistant Chloe came through with an unusual, strained pitch. Jasmine, Chloe said, her voice dropping to a nervous whisper. There is a man here to see you. He is from a vehicle recovery service. He says he has the legal paperwork for your Tesla. Jasmine froze. Her manicured fingers stopped hovering over her keyboard. A cold, heavy stone of dread settled in the pit of her stomach. She immediately pressed the intercom button again, her voice tight and controlled. Tell him there is a misunderstanding, Chloe. I will be right out. Jasmine stood up, smoothing the front of her tailored designer skirt. She forced her face into a mask of polite, unbothered confusion. She walked out of her private glass office and into the bustling main reception area. Several of her junior agents were on the phones, and two wealthy prospective buyers were sitting in the waiting area. A large, burly man in a high-visibility jacket stood at the reception desk holding a clipboard. "Excuse me," Jasmine said, approaching the man with her signature diplomatic smile. "I am Jasmine Blackwood. There seems to be a clerical error. My husband handles our vehicle leases through his corporate accounts." The man looked at her blankly, completely immune to her sophisticated aura. He tapped a thick stack of papers on his clipboard. "There is no error, ma'am. The lease payment has bounced for the third consecutive month. The bank issued the repossession order yesterday. My truck is parked right outside. I just need the key fob." Jasmine felt the blood drain from her face. She glanced frantically around the reception area. The junior agents had stopped talking. The prospective buyers were staring directly at her. The silence in the luxury office was absolute and deafening. Her flawless, untouchable reputation was bleeding out onto the Italian marble floor. "I will get the key," she whispered, her voice completely devoid of its usual authority. She turned on her heel and walked back into her private office, shutting the heavy glass door and locking it with a sharp click. Her hands were shaking violently as she grabbed her purse, dug out the sleek black key fob, and placed it on the desk. She could not breathe. 3 months. Cameron had not paid the lease in 3 months. He had bought that car for her as a grand romantic gesture, a public display of their immense wealth. She grabbed her cell phone and dialed his private number. It rang 4 times before dropping directly to his corporate voicemail. She dialed again. Ignored. She dialed a 3rd time, her thumb pressing into the screen with desperate force, sent straight to voicemail. "Cameron, answer the phone," she hissed to the empty room. Panic, raw and unfiltered, clawed at her throat. She dropped the phone and grabbed her laptop, pulling up their joint banking portal. She typed her password incorrectly twice before finally logging in. The screen loaded, displaying their various checking, savings, and investment accounts. Jasmine stared at the digital numbers, her mind refusing to process the mathematics. The primary checking account held $42.12. The high-yield savings account, which was supposed to hold their liquid emergency funds, showed a balance of 0. She frantically clicked into the investment portfolios, the accounts Cameron claimed were generating massive quarterly dividends. They were entirely empty. Every single account had been systematically drained, liquidated, and zeroed out over the past 8 months. There were massive, inexplicable wire transfers to offshore accounts and heavy withdrawals paid directly to unknown law firms. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The empire she thought she had married into was a complete and total illusion. There was no corporate merger. There was no generational wealth. Cameron was not a brilliant venture capitalist. He was a fraud, and he had pulled her down into his sinking ship. She had spent years defending him, alienating Kendra, and parading her fake wealth entirely funded by predatory debt and lies. She snatched the Tesla key fob from her desk, opened her office door just a fraction, and handed it to a terrified-looking Chloe. "Give this to the man outside," Jasmine ordered, her voice completely hollow. Jasmine needed a car. She had to get to Westchester. She grabbed her coat and practically ran out the back exit of her office building, dodging her employees entirely. She walked 3 blocks to a generic car rental agency, standing in line behind tourists and business travelers. She had to hand the clerk a low-limit corporate credit card she kept for office supplies just to rent a basic compact sedan. The humiliation of stepping into the cheap cloth interior rental car burned her skin, but she did not care. She jammed the keys into the ignition and sped toward the highway. It was auction day. The drive north to Westchester County was a blur of frantic anxiety and boiling rage. She broke every speed limit, her hands gripping the plastic steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She needed to look him in the eye. She needed to hear him admit that he had destroyed their lives. She pulled the cheap rental car onto the street bordering the county courthouse. The imposing stone building loomed ahead, the site of the public foreclosure auctions. Jasmine parked illegally near a fire hydrant and threw the car door open. The biting winter wind whipped her hair across her face as she marched toward the main entrance. She scanned the crowd of investors, lawyers, and distressed homeowners lingering on the wide concrete steps. Then she spotted him. Cameron was standing near one of the massive stone pillars. He was not surrounded by his imaginary elite Wall Street partners. He was entirely alone. He wore the same $3,000 suit he always wore, but it looked suddenly oversized, hanging loosely on his frame. His posture was completely defeated. His skin was pale, a sickly, terrifying shade of gray. He was staring blankly at the ground, clutching a thin, meaningless manila folder. He looked exactly like a man who had finally run out of lies. Jasmine stopped at the bottom of the steps, her breath pluming in the freezing air, watching the architect of her destruction tremble in the cold. I watched the pathetic tableau unfold from the heavy oak gallery above the main courthouse floor. Jasmine stood frozen at the bottom of the icy stone steps, her eyes locked onto Cameron. The absolute realization of her financial ruin was painted clearly across her face. She marched up the steps and grabbed his arm. He flinched, pulling away with a look of pure terror. I could not hear their words over the howling wind, but the frantic shaking of Cameron's head and the furious rage in Jasmine's posture told me everything. The illusion was dead. The heavy brass bells of the courthouse echoed through the rotunda, signaling the start of the morning foreclosure auctions. Cameron practically ran inside, desperate to escape his wife's wrath. Jasmine followed closely behind him, her face a mask of cold, calculating fury. I stepped back into the shadows of the upper gallery, perfectly concealed, while maintaining a clear view of the auction block below. David was already in position near the front row, wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal suit and holding a sleek leather portfolio. He looked exactly like a high-powered Manhattan attorney, representing a client with bottomless pockets. The auction room was a stark, depressing space filled with rows of hard wooden benches. Cameron shoved his way to the very back of the room, leaning against the pale green wall. He was sweating profusely, frantically wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. Jasmine stood a few feet away from him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, watching his every move with a venomous glare. Cameron knew he was cornered. He needed to maintain the lie, to pretend he was still the orchestrator of this brilliant corporate maneuver. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket, holding it to his ear with exaggerated urgency. He began pacing back and forth, putting on a theatrical performance for Jasmine's benefit. "Listen to me." Cameron projected his voice artificially loud, cutting through the low murmur of the auction room. "Yes, the property is coming up next. I need you to authorize the transfer right now. Do not worry about the baseline numbers. Just secure the asset. Yes, exactly. Bid whatever it takes. Do not let anyone outbid you. We need this property back in our portfolio today." He nodded emphatically to no one, pointing a finger in the air as if sealing a multi-million-dollar deal. Jasmine just stared at him, her eyes narrowing. She knew he was faking it. The sheer desperation radiating from his pores was impossible to ignore. The auctioneer, a tired county official, stepped up to the podium. He adjusted his microphone and began reading the legal description of my parents' estate. He listed the property address and the staggering amount of defaulted debt Cameron had secretly piled onto the house. Every word was a nail in the coffin of the Wilson family legacy. "We will start the bidding at $2.4 million to cover the outstanding loans and accrued county penalties," the auctioneer announced, looking out over the crowd. "Do I have an opening bid?" A representative from the primary lending bank immediately raised his numbered paddle. $2.4 million, the bank rep stated, securing their baseline interest in the property. Cameron kept his phone glued to his ear, nodding aggressively, pretending to relay the information to his imaginary tycoons. David stepped forward. He did not raise a paddle. He simply caught the auctioneer's eye and spoke with calm, devastating authority. $2.8 million, David said. A ripple of surprised whispers moved through the room. It was an aggressive opening jump designed to immediately intimidate any casual flippers looking for a cheap bargain. The bank representative frowned, consulting a spreadsheet on his clipboard. He raised his paddle again. $2.9 million. $3.2 million. David countered instantly, not missing a single beat. "And my client is prepared to close with 100% liquid cash today. No financing contingencies." The bank representative lowered his paddle, shaking his head. The numbers no longer made sense. A hush fell over the wooden benches. The aggressive all-cash offer had paralyzed the room. Cameron was practically vibrating against the back wall. He pumped his fist in the air, grinning wildly at Jasmine. "See," he mouthed, silently pointing down at David. "I told you, they are securing it." Jasmine did not smile back. She looked from Cameron to David, her expression unreadable but deeply suspicious. 3.2 million going once, the auctioneer called out, scanning the silent room. 3.2 million going twice. He paused, raising his wooden gavel high into the air. "Sold for $3.2 million cash to the representative for Phoenix Horizon, LLC." The sharp crack of the gavel echoed like a gunshot. The deed to the Westchester estate officially transferred hands. My parents were no longer the owners of their generational dynasty. I was. Cameron shoved his phone into his pocket, letting out a loud, shuddering breath of profound relief. He actually believed his own lie had manifested into reality. He pushed his way through the crowd of exiting spectators, rushing eagerly toward the front of the room, where David was calmly signing the final transfer documents. Cameron clapped a heavy hand onto David's shoulder. David stiffened slowly, turning his head to look at the offending hand, before locking eyes with my brother. "Man, am I glad to see you," Cameron said, his voice breathless with relief. "You cut that close, but that cash bid was brilliant. Hey, are you the guy my Wall Street partner sent? Did Harrison coordinate the corporate leaseback terms with you yet?" David did not smile or extend his hand to shake Cameron's. He simply stepped back, letting Cameron's hand drop awkwardly. David adjusted his cuffs, his expression devoid of warmth. "I do not know you," David said, his voice carrying cold precision. "My client acts entirely alone. Phoenix Horizon, LLC has no partners, no external associations, and certainly no leaseback agreements. The current occupants have exactly 30 days to vacate the premises before I file a formal eviction notice." Cameron froze. The blood vanished from his face, leaving him a ghastly white. His mouth hung open, struggling to form words that refused to materialize. He stared at David, the realization of his total destruction finally crashing down upon him. From the shadows of the upper gallery, I watched the arrogant light die in my brother's eyes. I smiled, ready to finalize the absolute collapse of their fraudulent empire. Cameron stood frozen on the steps of the Westchester courthouse. The icy wind tore through his suit, but he could not feel it. He watched David, the sharp Manhattan attorney, disappear into the bustling crowd. Cameron's mind raced frantically as he stood completely alone in the freezing cold. Phoenix Horizon, LLC, had just bought the estate for $3 million. Cameron had no idea who they were. He had no Wall Street partners. The corporate merger was a complete fabrication he invented to cover his debt. If he walked into that mansion and confessed the truth, Richard would not just disown him. Richard would likely try to kill him. His father's rage was a terrifying force, and Cameron had lost the most important asset the family possessed. He pictured his mother Beatrice weeping on the floor, her precious social standing permanently annihilated. He pictured Jasmine's furious face when she discovered their accounts were utterly empty. The immense pressure was suffocating. Cameron wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. He took a shuddering breath and made the only choice a desperate narcissist could make. He decided to double down on the lie. He would buy himself time. Maybe he could secure another predatory loan. He just needed a few more weeks. He walked to his Porsche and climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles ached. He rehearsed his lines the entire drive back, forcing his panicked heartbeat to slow down, practicing his signature arrogant smirk. When Cameron pushed open the heavy front doors of the estate, the tension in the grand foyer was thick. Richard was pacing across the imported marble floor. Beatrice was sitting rigidly on a velvet settee, twisting her diamond wedding band. The second the door clicked shut, they snapped their heads toward him. Their eyes were wide and pleading. Cameron loosened his silk tie, projecting the victorious aura of a corporate warrior. He allowed a slow, confident smile to spread across his pale face. My partner's LLC won the bid. We are safe, Cameron announced, letting out a theatrical sigh of relief. They absolutely crushed the bank's representative on the floor. It was a bloodbath, but we came out on top. Richard stopped pacing. The tension instantly melted. He let out a booming laugh, crossed the foyer, and pulled Cameron into a tight hug. I knew it, Richard shouted, slapping Cameron hard on the back. I knew my son would not let this family down. You had the killer instinct required for high-stakes finance. You beat those bureaucratic vultures at their own game. Beatrice burst into tears of profound joy and vindicated arrogance. She rushed forward and threw her arms around Cameron's neck, sobbing into his suit. Oh, my brilliant boy, Beatrice wept loudly. I never doubted you for a single second. I knew you would save our legacy. When will they send the paperwork? Richard asked, pulling back to look at his son. We need to finalize this and get that disgusting yellow notice off our record permanently. Cameron forced another reassuring smile. They will send over the new lease agreement next week. Like I said, it will be pennies on the dollar, a formality for the tax write-off. Beatrice wiped her eyes, her posture transforming back to a haughty socialite. We cannot just sit quietly and wait, she declared, her voice regaining its sharp edge. We need to control the narrative immediately. That horrible Mrs. Harrington drove past when the sheriff posted that notice. She has probably told half the country club that we are bankrupt. We need to crush those rumors. I am going to host a victory dinner, she announced. We will show them that we beat the bank. Cameron felt a fresh wave of panic hit him, but he simply nodded, trapped entirely inside his own rapidly collapsing illusion. Meanwhile, 30 miles south, in a Manhattan high-rise, the real buyer of the Westchester estate was sitting behind her polished mahogany desk. The heavy glass door swung open, and David walked in. He looked sharp, professional, and highly satisfied. He carried a single manila folder and placed it directly in the center of my desk. The auction was a complete success, David stated, taking a seat opposite me. We secured the property for $3.2 million. The bank representative backed down immediately when I offered liquid cash. The judge banged the gavel 20 minutes ago. I opened the folder. Inside was the official notarized deed to the Westchester estate. The house where I had grown up. The house where I had been endlessly belittled, marginalized, and eventually banished. The house that Richard and Beatrice believed was their untouchable fortress of superiority. I picked up my favorite silver pen. I looked at the signature line. This was the exact moment the power dynamic permanently shifted. I was no longer the disappointing daughter. I was the landlord. I signed my name with a smooth, fluid motion, finalizing the transfer of power. I was now the legal owner of my childhood home. I closed the folder and looked up at David. A cold, genuine smile touched my lips. My parents think Cameron's imaginary partners bought the house. They believe they are getting a sweetheart deal to stay there indefinitely. David chuckled softly. Your brother actually approached me after the auction. He asked if I was the guy his partner sent. He is absolutely terrified, Kendra. He is clinging to a lie that is going to destroy him. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap. Let us help him maintain that lie just a little bit longer, I said smoothly. I want them to feel comfortable. I want them to host their dinner parties and brag to their friends. And then I want to pull the floor out from under them. David pulled a sleek tablet from his briefcase. What are your instructions regarding the lease agreement? David, draft a new lease. $15,000 a month or a 48-hour eviction notice. The drive back to Manhattan in the cheap rental car was suffocating for Jasmine. Every bump in the road mocked her previous life of air-conditioned luxury. She gripped the plastic steering wheel, her mind replaying the devastating scene on the courthouse steps. Cameron had lied to his parents with the exact same effortless conviction he had used to lie to her. There was no corporate buyout. There was no Wall Street savior. He was a cornered animal playing make-believe to avoid his father's wrath. But Jasmine was not Beatrice. She was not going to sit blindly and plan a victory dinner while the walls caved in around them. She needed answers. She needed to know exactly who possessed the power to evict them all. Jasmine bypassed their lavish apartment entirely and drove straight back to her boutique agency. The office was quiet. Most of her staff had left for the day. She walked past the spot where the repo man had stood hours earlier, ignoring the lingering stares of her assistant. Jasmine locked herself inside her glass-walled office, threw her designer coat onto the sofa, and powered up her dual-monitor workstation. She possessed top-tier access to commercial real estate databases, municipal tax registries, and corporate filing systems. It was the absolute advantage of her profession, and she was going to use every single tool at her disposal. She typed Phoenix Horizon LLC into the primary search bar. The system churned for a moment before returning a sterile generic corporate profile. The LLC had been formed less than a month ago in Delaware. The registered address was a post office box in Wilmington. There were no listed directors, no public shareholders, and no operational history. It was a classic ghost corporation, a financial shell designed specifically to shield the identity of a high-net-worth buyer. Whoever purchased the Westchester estate wanted total anonymity. Jasmine scoffed, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Anonymity was a luxury for amateurs. She pulled up the state property tax transfer records, cross-referencing the courthouse auction data with the Delaware registry. She spent 2 hours chasing digital shadows. Every time she found a thread, it led to another dead end. Phoenix Horizon was owned by a holding company called Apex Ventures, which was managed by a blind trust registered in Nevada. The layers of obfuscation were incredibly sophisticated. This was not a quick flip by a casual investor. This was a highly calculated, heavily funded acquisition. Her eyes burned from staring at the bright screens. The digital clock on her taskbar read exactly 8 in the evening. She was running out of options. She leaned back in her ergonomic chair, rubbing her temples. She needed to think differently. She stopped looking at the money and started looking at the legal architecture. Whoever set up the Nevada Trust had to file initial articles of incorporation. Even if they used a registered agent, there had to be an originating signature on the very first document before the privacy shields were fully activated. Jasmine bypassed the standard commercial search engines and logged directly into the Nevada Secretary of State portal using a premium broker account. She pulled the founding charter for the specific blind trust managing Apex Ventures. The document loaded slowly, scanning as a grainy digital PDF. She scrolled past pages of boilerplate legal jargon, her eyes scanning the bottom of each page for authorizing signatures. Most were stamped by a generic corporate proxy firm. Then she reached the final addendum. It was a scanned copy of an original wet ink signature authorizing the initial capital transfer to establish the trust. Jasmine stared at the screen. The handwriting was sharp, angular, and instantly familiar. She had seen that exact signature on dozens of awkward family birthday cards, holiday gifts, and forced thank you notes over the past decade. It was a signature she had always dismissed with absolute contempt. Jasmine reached for the cold cup of coffee resting on the edge of her desk. Her hand was trembling so violently that her fingers lost their grip on the porcelain handle. The cup slipped crashing onto the glass desk and shattering into pieces. Cold brown liquid splattered across her keyboard and dripped onto her expensive Italian heels, but she did not even flinch. She did not feel the mess. She could only feel the earth-shattering weight of the truth. Her loser sister-in-law, the tech support worker they had relentlessly mocked and banished from the family, had just purchased a multi-million-dollar mansion in pure cash. Kendra was Phoenix Horizon. Kendra owned the estate. Kendra held their entire family legacy in the palm of her hand. The sheer scale of the deception and the impending humiliation hit Jasmine like a freight train. She grabbed her purse, leaving the shattered coffee cup and ruined keyboard behind. She sprinted to the elevator, her heart hammering against her ribs. She hailed a cab outside, abandoning the cheap rental car entirely. The ride back to their building felt like an eternity. When Jasmine finally kicked open the door to their luxury apartment, the space was cloaked in darkness. The only light came from the massive flat-screen television illuminating Cameron's pathetic figure. He was slumped on the expensive leather sofa, an empty glass dangling from his fingers. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused, offering a weak defensive smile. "Where have you been?" Cameron slurred, trying to sit up straight. "I told my parents the good news. Everything is fine. The partners are sending the lease. We just have to hold out a little longer." Jasmine did not take off her coat. She walked slowly to the center of the living room, blocking his view of the television. She stared down at the man she had married, feeling nothing but absolute freezing disgust. The facade was entirely stripped away. "Stop talking right now, Cameron," Jasmine whispered. "Who really bought your parents' house today?" Cameron flinched as if I had struck him across the face. The whiskey in his glass sloshed over the rim, staining the expensive Turkish rug beneath his feet. He stared at me, his mouth working silently for a fraction of a second before his defensive instincts kicked into overdrive. His face twisted into an ugly mask of outraged entitlement. He slammed the heavy crystal glass down onto the coffee table with enough force to threaten the glass top. "Are you crazy?" Cameron barked, his voice echoing loudly off the high ceilings of our penthouse apartment. "You are completely out of your mind, Jasmine." Kendra. "You think my pathetic, socially awkward sister bought a $3 million estate? She makes $60,000 a year fixing routers in a windowless basement. She wears off-brand sneakers and brings her lunch in Tupperware. She does not even own a car." He stepped toward me aggressively, invading my personal space, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. This was a new tactic, a terrifying escalation of his usual smooth manipulation. "You are losing your mind because of the car repo this morning," Cameron sneered, pointing a finger directly at my face. "You are letting a minor cash flow hiccup trigger a paranoid delusion. I told you my Wall Street partners bought the house. Phoenix Horizon is a subsidiary of a massive holding company based out of Nevada. My guys secured it. We are leasing it back. It is a brilliant tax strategy, and you are standing here accusing me of lying to you." I looked up at him. I did not step back. I did not shrink away. I am a highly successful Black woman who built her own luxury real estate agency from nothing. I deal with arrogant, lying men every single day of my life. I know exactly how to spot a fraud, and looking at Cameron now, the fraud was entirely absolute. I saw the desperate sweat beading on his upper lip. I saw the slight tremor in the hand he was pointing at me. I saw the terrifying realization in his eyes that I had caught him. He was violently gaslighting me, trying to warp my reality, to protect his fragile, collapsing ego. He was a cornered rat. If I pushed him right now, he would become dangerous. I needed to be smarter than him. I needed an exit strategy. "You are right," I said, softening my voice and letting my shoulders drop, faking a posture of total exhaustion. "I am sorry, Cameron. The repo guy showing up at my office in front of clients just humiliated me. I panicked. I let my imagination run wild." Cameron let out a loud, exaggerated breath, running both hands through his perfectly styled hair. His relief was palpable, almost pathetic. "Exactly," he said, his arrogant smirk instantly returning. "You just need to trust me, Jasmine. I am the financial expert here. I have everything completely under control. The funds will clear next week, and I will buy you a brand new Porsche to replace that leased Tesla. Just let the men handle the heavy lifting." I forced a grateful smile, suppressing the violent urge to slap him. "I'm going to take a bath," I murmured. "I just need to decompress." I turned and walked away, feeling his smug gaze on my back. I entered the master suite, walked directly into my massive walk-in closet, and quietly locked the heavy wooden door behind me. The facade of the submissive, apologetic wife instantly vanished. My face turned to stone. I reached up to the highest shelf and pulled down a sleek, unbranded black leather duffel bag. I was not going down with this sinking ship. I had worked far too hard to build my immaculate reputation to let Cameron drag me into federal prison for wire fraud. I moved with swift, silent precision. I bypassed the designer clothes and went straight for the hidden floor safe. I punched in my private combination and pulled out my emergency reserves. I stacked thick bands of $100 bills into the bottom of the duffel bag. Next came my luxury watches, my tennis bracelets, and the heavy diamond necklace Cameron had given me for our anniversary, which I fully intended to pawn. I grabbed my passport, my birth certificate, and the physical security tokens for my private offshore accounts that Cameron knew absolutely nothing about. I zipped the bag shut and shoved it deep behind a row of winter coats. I had my go bag. I would play the loving, supportive wife for exactly as long as it took to secure my legal divorce strategy. I would let him walk blindly into the absolute slaughterhouse Kendra was preparing for him. I wanted a front row seat to watch him burn. As I sat on the edge of the velvet dressing ottoman, my cell phone buzzed loudly in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a mass text message sent to the entire Wilson family group chat. The sender was Beatrice. Victory dinner this Saturday at 7 in the evening, the text read. Formal attire is absolutely required. We beat the bank and secured our legacy. I want the entire family here to celebrate Cameron's financial brilliance. There was a secondary message immediately following it sent directly to the same group thread so everyone could see it. Kendra, you are entirely excluded from this dinner. Beatrice wrote her venomous cruelty on full public display. However, I wanted you to remain on this text thread so you could see what a successful, loyal family actually looks like. Actions have consequences, and your jealousy has permanently banished you from our table. I stared at the screen, my jaw tight. The sheer unchecked delusion of that woman was staggering. She was standing in a house she no longer owned, planning a lavish dinner party, funded by predatory debt, completely unaware that the guillotine was already dropping. Before I could even process the absolute audacity of Beatrice's message, another text popped up on the screen. It was a reply from Kendra. The response was sent to the entire group. Have a great time in my house. The group chat went dead silent. Nobody typed a single word for 5 full minutes. Sitting in the master bedroom, Cameron let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed down the hallway. He shouted toward the closed closet door. Can you believe my sister Jasmine? She is completely unhinged. She actually thinks she can ruin my mother's party with a bitter, pathetic joke. She is so jealous of my success, she is losing her mind. I sat in the closet staring at Kendra's icy, precise text message. My hands were shaking not from fear, but from the electric thrill of impending devastation. I knew it was not a joke. Kendra was not playing games. Beatrice thought she was banishing her daughter, but Kendra held the deed. I looked at the hidden duffel bag in the shadows. I was ready. I was going to that dinner, and I was going to watch Kendra tear their entire fake dynasty down to the absolute bedrock. Cameron stared at me, his face completely draining of color. He blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He tried to muster his usual arrogant indignation, but his voice cracked under the pressure. My partners bought it, Jasmine. Phoenix Horizon. I told you. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I just looked at him with absolute freezing contempt. You are a pathetic, lying coward, Cameron. I turned away, ignoring his desperate protests as he followed me down the hallway. I walked into the guest bedroom, locked the door, and spent the night in total silence. I knew the truth. Kendra owned the estate. Cameron was orchestrating a massive suicidal delusion, and I was going to let him dig his own grave. I needed him completely distracted by his own lies so I could finalize my exit strategy, which meant I had to play the part of the dutiful wife for one more night. I had to attend Beatrice's ridiculous dinner. Saturday evening arrived with a bitter, freezing rain that pounded against the massive windows of the Westchester estate. Inside, however, the atmosphere was suffocatingly warm and aggressively opulent. Beatrice had spared absolutely no expense, presumably putting the entire catering bill on a credit card she could never repay. The grand dining room was a blinding display of crystal-polished silver and massive floral centerpieces that smelled heavily of lilies and forced superiority. 20 guests filled the room. It was a carefully curated mix of wealthy, snooty neighbors and extended family members who had been specifically invited to witness the Wilson family's triumphant survival. Waiters in white jackets circulated with silver trays, pouring endless streams of vintage champagne into crystal flutes. Beatrice was holding court near the roaring fireplace, draped in a floor-length emerald silk gown. She was laughing too loudly, projecting an aura of absolute invincibility. We simply refuse to be bullied by bureaucratic bankers, Beatrice boasted to a wealthy neighbor whose husband owned a massive hedge fund. The system is designed to intimidate, but when you have a son with a brilliant financial mind, you simply outmaneuver them. We secured a corporate leaseback structure that is practically revolutionary. I stood quietly near the edge of the room wearing a tailored black dress sipping sparkling water. I watched the performance with clinical detachment. Richard stepped to the center of the room. He picked up a silver spoon and tapped it sharply against his crystal champagne flute. The clear ringing sound immediately silenced the chatter. The guests turned their attention to the patriarch of the Wilson family. Richard stood tall, puffing out his chest, radiating the toxic, unchecked arrogance that had defined his entire life. He raised his glass toward Cameron, who was standing near the mahogany bar. "I want to propose a toast," Richard boomed, his voice carrying easily across the large room. "This family has always been built on strength, resilience, and unyielding intelligence. Recently, we faced an absurd, entirely fabricated misunderstanding with our lending institution. They attempted to take advantage of a temporary error to steal our legacy. But they severely underestimated the Wilson bloodline." Richard smiled warmly at Cameron. He looked at my husband with a level of pride he had never ever shown to Kendra. "They underestimated my son." Richard continued, his voice swelling with emotion. "Cameron stepped into the ring with the Wolves and completely dominated them. He leveraged his partnerships, utilized his financial genius, and secured a brilliant corporate acquisition that keeps this estate exactly where it belongs. In our hands." To Cameron, the savior of the Wilson dynasty. The guests erupted into enthusiastic applause. They raised their glasses, chanting Cameron's name. I kept my glass of sparkling water lowered. I looked directly at the savior of the Wilson dynasty. Cameron looked like he was going to vomit. He was sweating profusely. Large, shiny beads of moisture gathered on his forehead and rolled down his neck, soaking the collar of his custom-tailored shirt. He raised his glass with a trembling hand, forcing a rigid, ghastly smile that did not reach his panicked, bloodshot eyes. He downed his champagne in one gulp and immediately signaled the bartender for a heavy pour of neat bourbon. I knew exactly why he was sweating. He had been checking his phone obsessively every 3 minutes since we arrived. He was waiting for a fake partner to send a fake lease. I had seen the physical mail sitting on the foyer console when we walked in. There was a certified priority envelope from Phoenix Horizon, LLC. I recognized the return address from my database search. Cameron had intercepted it, shoving it into his jacket pocket before his parents could see it. He had received the 5-day warning to vacate the premises. He knew his parents were bankrupt. He knew they were being evicted by his banished sister. He knew the absolute destruction of his life was actively counting down, and he was drinking heavily to mask his suffocating terror. I took a slow sip of my water. He was a dead man walking, smiling for the crowd while standing on a trapdoor. Suddenly, a sound cut through the ambient jazz music and the clinking of expensive silverware. It was the doorbell. It was not a polite neighborly ring. It was followed immediately by a heavy, aggressive, authoritative knock that rattled the massive wooden double doors of the grand foyer. The guests paused their conversations, looking toward the entryway in mild confusion. Beatrice simply laughed, waving her manicured hand dismissively as she adjusted her emerald gown. "Oh, that must be the premium caviar delivery," Beatrice announced to the room, her voice dripping with extreme practiced arrogance. "I demanded they source it directly from Russia for tonight. Excuse me for just one moment, everyone." Beatrice turned gracefully and walked out of the dining room. She crossed the foyer, her heels clicking sharply. She reached out and pulled open the front door. The icy wind swept into the grand foyer the second the heavy oak doors swung open. Beatrice stood frozen on the marble threshold, her welcoming, arrogant smile snapping into a mask of pure shock. There was no delivery boy holding a chilled tin of imported Russian caviar. There was only the freezing rain and the undeniable reality standing on her front porch. Kendra looked nothing like the marginalized, exhausted tech support worker they had banished from their lives. She stood tall, framed by the stone pillars of the entryway, radiating an aura of absolute terrifying authority. She wore a stunning, razor-sharp charcoal designer suit that fit her with lethal precision. A tailored wool overcoat was draped over her shoulders. Her posture was flawless. Her expression was completely devoid of emotion. She looked like an executioner. Flanking her right side was David holding a sleek leather briefcase looking every inch the Manhattan corporate shark he was. And flanking her left, standing with imposing silent authority, were two uniformed Westchester County Sheriff deputies. Their hands rested near their utility belts. Their expressions were dead serious. Beatrice let out a sharp, breathless gasp. Her hands flew to the diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. She tried to speak, but her throat seemed to close in on itself. She took a clumsy step backward, her expensive emerald silk gown dragging against the wet marble floor. "What is the meaning of this?" Beatrice finally shrieked, her voice cracking, completely shattering the sophisticated ambiance of the dinner party. "How dare you show up here?" The sudden, frantic pitch of Beatrice's voice immediately stopped the music and the polite chatter in the dining room. Chair legs scraped against the hardwood floors as guests stood up to investigate the commotion. Richard was the first to reach the foyer. He marched out of the dining room with his chest puffed out, holding a fresh glass of bourbon ready to unleash his wrath on whatever unfortunate service worker had upset his wife. Then he saw his daughter. Richard stopped dead in his tracks. The blood rushed to his face, turning his complexion a dangerous shade of crimson. The sight of Kendra standing confidently on his porch, flanked by law enforcement, ignited a fury so deep it seemed to shake his entire frame. He stormed past Beatrice, his expensive leather shoes echoing loudly across the entryway. "I told you never to show your face at this house again!" Richard roared, pointing a trembling, furious finger directly at Kendra's face. "You are a disgrace to this family. You have absolutely no right to be here, especially tonight." Kendra did not flinch. She did not shrink away or apologize like the scared little girl they remembered. She simply stood her ground, her eyes locked onto her father with a cold, unwavering intensity. David stood silently beside her, watching the patriarch self-destruct. Cameron had finally emerged from the dining room, trailing behind the wealthy neighbors and extended family members who were now crowding into the grand foyer. Jasmine stood slightly apart from the group, her arms folded across her chest, watching her husband. Cameron looked like a ghost. His skin was translucent. His hands shook so violently he had to grip the edge of the hallway console to keep himself upright. He knew exactly what was happening, and he was completely powerless to stop it. Richard continued his tirade, his voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. He performed for his guests, desperate to maintain his facade of absolute control. "You are jealous," Richard shouted, taking another aggressive step toward the open doorway. "You found out your brother saved this family, that he secured a multi-million-dollar corporate buyout, and you came here to ruin his victory. You are pathetic, Kendra." Kendra slowly tilted her head. She looked past her father and made direct eye contact with Cameron. Cameron swallowed hard, looking away instantly. "Is that what he told you?" Richard Kendra asked, her voice smooth, cutting through the tense air like a scalpel. "He told you his partners bought the house?" "Do not speak to me," Richard spat. He turned his attention to the two imposing officers standing on the porch. He puffed out his chest, using his best country club authority voice. "Officers, I demand you arrest this woman immediately. She is trespassing on private property. My son's corporate partners own this estate, and we are the legal exclusive tenants. Remove her right now." The guests murmured among themselves. A few of the snooty neighbors nodded in agreement, waiting to see the unwanted daughter dragged away in handcuffs. Beatrice sneered, recovering her arrogant posture, ready to watch Kendra be publicly humiliated. The lead deputy, a broad-shouldered man, stepped forward. He did not reach for his handcuffs. He ignored Kendra. Instead, he looked directly at Richard. His expression was completely rigid, utterly unimpressed by Richard's wealth or his loud demands. "Sir, I am going to need you to step back and lower your voice," the deputy commanded, his tone, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. Richard blinked, genuinely stunned that a county employee would dare speak to him in such a manner. "I am the patriarch of this family," Richard yelled, his face turning purple. "I demand you remove this trespasser." The lead deputy rested his hand on his utility belt. He looked around the crowded foyer, taking in the shocked faces of the wealthy guests in their formal attire, the glittering chandeliers, and the sheer arrogance of the man screaming at him. Then he delivered the reality check that would permanently shatter the Wilson family dynasty. The lead deputy did not move to grab Kendra. Instead, he looked at Richard. "Sir, we are here to escort the legal property owner, and according to the county deed, that is this woman." The entire dinner party fell dead silent. Beatrice dropped her champagne flute. The expensive crystals shattered against the floor, a sharp, violent crash, mirroring their absolute total destruction. The sharp crash of crystal against marble severed the final thread of the Wilson family illusion. Champagne foamed around Beatrice's heels, soaking the delicate hem of her emerald gown, but she did not even look down. Her eyes remained locked on the lead deputy, her mind violently rejecting the terrifying words he had just spoken. Richard stood frozen beside her. The angry red color drained completely from his face, replaced by a sickly, horrifying pale hue. He opened his mouth to scream another command to reassert his dominance over the situation, but his vocal cords failed him entirely. The reality of his absolute powerlessness was paralyzing. Kendra did not wait for her parents to recover their voices. She did not ask for permission to enter the house. She had grown up in the house where she had been systematically marginalized and ignored for her entire life. She simply stepped over the shattered glass. Her designer heels clicked with a lethal, steady rhythm against the marble floor. She glided right past her statuesque parents, leaving them standing in the drafty entryway with the armed deputies. David followed closely behind her, clutching his sleek leather briefcase, the ultimate herald of their financial doom. Kendra walked purposefully into the grand dining room. The 20 wealthy neighbors and extended family members were completely silent. Their previous enthusiastic cheers for Cameron choked in their throats. They stared at Kendra taking in her immaculate charcoal suit and the cold, terrifying authority radiating from her posture. She walked directly toward the center of the massive mahogany dining table. It was laden with decadent displays of arrogant wealth, towering floral arrangements, vintage wine bottles, and an absurdly lavish charcuterie board, piled high with imported meats, artisan cheeses, and fresh honeycomb. David stepped forward and smoothly unclasped his briefcase. He withdrew a thick, heavy legal folder and handed it to Kendra. She opened it, pulling out the heavily watermarked, officially notarized county property deed. She did not hand it to Richard. She did not offer it to Beatrice. She held it up for a fraction of a second, letting the gold county seal catch the bright light of the crystal chandelier. Then she dropped it directly into the center of the dining table. The heavy paper slapped against the polished wood, sliding right over the edge of the extravagant charcuterie board, knocking a silver cheese knife onto the expensive Persian rug. "Good evening, everyone," Kendra announced. Her voice was perfectly level, carrying effortlessly across the silent, opulent room. "I am the CEO of Phoenix Horizon LLC. I hope you are enjoying the catering in my dining room." The collective gasp from the dinner guests was audible. A woman wearing a diamond choker covered her mouth in absolute shock. A hedge fund manager sitting near the end of the table awkwardly set down his silver fork, his eyes darting frantically between the legal document and Kendra's unyielding face. The social hierarchy of the room had just been violently inverted, and the elite guests were desperate to distance themselves from the immediate blast zone. They recognized real power when they saw it, and it no longer belonged to Richard and Beatrice. Beatrice finally found her voice. She stormed into the dining room, her emerald gown swishing furiously against the floor. She pointed a trembling, manic finger at the document resting on the table. "This is a fake!" Beatrice shrieked. Her voice was shrill, desperate, and entirely devoid of its usual aristocratic polish. She looked around at her wealthy friends, her eyes wide with panic, begging them to believe her rapidly crumbling narrative. "It is a pathetic forgery. She is lying to you. My son secured this property today. Cameron's corporate partners bought this house at the auction. We have an exclusive lease agreement." Kendra did not even look at her mother. She slowly turned her head and locked her gaze squarely on Cameron. Her brother was standing frozen near the mahogany bar, gripping his empty bourbon glass like it was a life preserver. He looked entirely broken. The heavy sweating had plastered his expensive custom shirt to his chest. His breathing was shallow and erratic. He looked exactly like a man who knew he was about to be pushed off a very high, very jagged cliff. "Tell them," Cameron Kendra instructed. Her tone was completely devoid of any sibling affection or pity. Her words were a direct order, an executioner demanding a final statement before dropping the blade. "Tell them about your imaginary Wall Street friends. Tell your mother who actually bought her house." The entire room shifted their attention to Cameron. Beatrice looked at her golden boy, her eyes pleading for him to shut down this nightmare to unleash his supposed corporate fury. Richard marched into the room, his fists clenched, waiting for his son to defend their honor. Jasmine remained completely still in the shadows of the corner, her arms crossed over her chest. She sipped her sparkling water in silence, watching her husband suffocate under the crushing weight of his own monumental deception. She felt no pity, only a cold, vindicated satisfaction. Cameron's mouth worked uselessly. He looked at his mother's desperate face, then at his father's demanding, expectant glare, and finally at Kendra's merciless, unblinking expression. The pressure in the room was absolute. There was nowhere left to run, no more lies to weave, no more fake corporate entities to hide behind. The grand illusion was dead. Cameron started. His voice cracked pitifully. He cleared his throat, sounding exactly like a terrified, cornered child rather than a financial genius. "I can fix this. Kendra, please, just give me a chance to explain. We can work this out privately. Please." The sound of his total surrender hit Beatrice like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, bumping hard into a heavy dining chair, her hands flying to her face as the horrifying truth finally penetrated her delusion. Richard let out a low, guttural sound of pure disbelief, staring at his son as if he had just transformed into a monster. The golden child had lied to them. The savior was a complete fraud. The empire was gone. Kendra did not show an ounce of mercy. She did not lower her voice to accommodate his sudden, pathetic desire for privacy. She took a deliberate step closer to him, closing the distance, forcing him to cower under her authority. "You can fix it by paying rent," Kendra stated, her voice slicing through the heavy, suffocating silence of the room. She snapped her fingers. David instantly pulled a second document from his briefcase and slammed it down onto the dining table right next to the deed. "Here is your new lease," Kendra announced, staring directly into Cameron's panicked, bloodshot eyes. $15,000 a month. First and last month are due right now tonight in certified funds, or the sheriffs waiting in the foyer will execute this 48-hour eviction notice. The sharp sound of the breaking crystal hung in the air, followed by the steady, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. Nobody moved to clean up the mess. The wealthy hedge fund manager, who had been praising Cameron just moments before, carefully pushed his heavy chair back from the table, physically distancing himself from the toxic fallout. The other wealthy guests exchanged panicked, wide-eyed glances. They were trapped in the blast zone of a spectacular family implosion. Richard stared at the eviction notice resting beside the deed. The stark black text demanded $15,000. The blood slowly rushed back into his face, transforming his pale shock into a frantic, cornered rage. He could not accept this defeat. He could not let these influential neighbors watch his banished daughter humiliate him in his own home. He had to reclaim the narrative. He slammed his fist onto the mahogany table, making the expensive silverware jump. "You vindictive little girl!" Richard bellowed, his voice raw and echoing with desperation. He pointed a trembling finger at Kendra. "You come in here trying to destroy your brother over a simple financial miscalculation. Cameron just made a bad investment." The market turned against him. It happens to the best businessmen. At least he stepped up into the ring. At least he tried to save us while you plotted against your own flesh and blood. Kendra did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She possessed the ultimate leverage, and she let his desperate screaming wash over her like a harmless breeze. A slow, chilling smile spread across her face. It was a smile completely devoid of warmth, a predatory expression that made Richard instinctively take a step back. "A bad investment?" Kendra asked, her tone conversational, but laced with absolute venom. "Is that what we call felony fraud now?" The word fraud echoed through the grand dining room. The guests gasped in unison. Beatrice clutched the back of a dining chair, her knuckles turning white. Cameron let out a strangled, pathetic sound, his knees buckling slightly. He grabbed the edge of the mahogany bar to keep from collapsing onto the floor. Jasmine took a sharp breath, her eyes darting from Kendra to the sweating, trembling mess of a man she had married. Kendra did not break eye contact with her father. She simply raised her right hand and snapped her fingers once. David stepped forward instantly. The sleek Manhattan lawyer opened his leather briefcase again. He withdrew a second, much thicker manila folder. He did not hand it to Kendra. He slapped it directly onto the center of the dining table, right on top of the eviction notice and the property deed. Kendra placed her hand flat on the heavy folder. She leaned forward, resting her weight against the polished wood. Cameron did not just lose the house, Richard. He did not just make a poor strategic decision with a shell company. She paused, letting the silence amplify her next words. He forged your signature. Richard blinked heavily, his jaw dropping open. He looked from Kendra to the folder, then back to Kendra. His arrogant posture evaporated instantly. What are you talking about? Richard choked out his voice, reduced to a hoarse whisper. Kendra flipped the folder open. She spread the pages out across the table, revealing pristine copies of banking documents, loan applications, and certified transfer records. She tapped a freshly manicured finger against a signature line on the top document. He forged your signature to take out a $300,000 high-interest secondary loan against your already failing business assets, Kendra stated clearly, ensuring every single guest in the room heard the exact figure. He did not use that money to save this estate. He used it to desperately cover his massive, catastrophic cryptocurrency losses. Your golden child committed identity theft against you. The dining room descended into absolute chaos. Beatrice let out a piercing wail, covering her ears, as if trying to block out the reality of her son's crimes. Several guests murmured loudly, whispering the words identity theft and crypto losses to each other. Jasmine stepped completely out of the shadows, her face contorted in pure disgust. She stared at Cameron, realizing the depths of his financial depravity. Richard ignored the screaming and the frantic whispering. He practically lunged across the wide dining table, snatching the top document from the pile. He held it up to the bright light of the crystal chandelier, his hands shaking violently. He stared at the ink on the signature line. It looked completely perfect. It looked exactly like his own flowing handwriting, but the printed date next to the signature was from a Tuesday when he had been out of the country playing golf in Scotland. He had never seen this legal document before in his entire life. Cameron, Richard roared, turning his furious gaze toward the bar. Tell me this is a lie. Tell me you did not steal my name. Cameron could not look at his angry father. He stared downward at his expensive Italian leather shoes, hot tears streaming down his face, mixing with the heavy beads of sweat. I was going to pay it all back. Cameron sobbed, his voice terribly high and thin, cracking under the immense pressure. The volatile market was supposed to rebound quickly. I just needed a little more capital to average down my positions. I was going to fix everything before you even knew it was missing. Kendra stood perfectly tall, coldly observing the absolute public destruction of the golden child. She adjusted the cuffs of her charcoal suit. You cannot fix this with another lie, Cameron, she said, her voice echoing with finality. The bank discovered the discrepancy during the foreclosure audit. I purchased the debt along with the property deed. They are not interested in your excuses. The bank is pressing charges, and the fraud investigators have already forwarded the file to the district attorney. Richard snatched the application from the center of the table. The heavy parchment crumpled slightly under his frantic grip. He stared at the signature line. It was a flawless imitation of his own handwriting. But Kendra was right. The date printed beneath the ink exposed the entire lie. He had been playing the back nine at St. Andrews on that exact Tuesday. He had the clubhouse receipts to prove it. The reality of the forgery struck him with the force of a physical blow. His chest heaved. The golden child, the brilliant mind he paraded in front of his peers, had stolen his identity. The legacy he had sacrificed his daughter to protect was a complete, humiliating sham. Richard slowly lowered the paper. The fierce, untouchable patriarch of the Wilson family, looked suddenly frail, his broad shoulders sagging under the weight of the betrayal. He turned his gaze toward his son. The pride that usually filled his eyes when he looked at Cameron was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, hollow devastation. Cameron could not withstand his cold stare. The last remaining threads of his composure snapped. His knees gave out. He collapsed onto the hardwood floor, landing heavily beside a fallen silver napkin ring. The fabric of his tailored trousers pooled around him. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with violent sobs. The sound of his weeping was pathetic, a high, reedy whining that filled the silent room. "Dad, I am so sorry," Cameron wailed, his voice muffled by his trembling fingers. I panicked. The margin calls were coming in every hour. The accounts were draining. I just needed liquidity to keep the estate afloat. I was trying to save our name. "Please, Dad, you have to believe me. I can fix this. You know the bank president. You can call him. You can make this go away. Please do not let them take me to jail." Richard did not move. He did not reach out to comfort his weeping son. He stood completely paralyzed, staring at the ruined heir on the floor. Beatrice remained frozen against the wall, her hands clamped tightly over her mouth, watching her perfect world burn to the ground. Then a chair scraped sharply against the floorboards. Jasmine stood up. The entire room held its breath. The weeping on the floor momentarily subsided as Cameron peeked through his fingers, looking up at his wife. Jasmine did not look angry. She did not look sad. She looked entirely detached, radiating a surgical, terrifying calm. She walked slowly around the edge of the large mahogany table. Her heels clicked softly, each step sounding like a countdown. She stopped directly in front of her kneeling husband. She looked down at him with absolute, pure, unfiltered disgust. Cameron reached out a shaking hand, grabbing the hem of her designer dress. "Jasmine, please." He begged, his face smeared with sweat and tears. "I did this for us. I did this to keep the lifestyle you deserve. We can start over." Jasmine snatched her dress away from his grasp, as if he were a diseased animal. "Do not you dare put this on me," she commanded, her voice dropping to a lethal, icy register. "You did not do this for us. You did this because you are a weak, arrogant coward who refused to admit he was failing." She reached into her purse and pulled out her stack of folded papers, tossing them onto the floor beside him. Kendra had done her research, but Jasmine had done her own. "You used my credit," Jasmine stated, her voice slicing through the tension. "You opened 3 separate corporate accounts using my business tax identification numbers. You leveraged the reputation I spent 8 years building from the ground up to fund your idiotic cryptocurrency gambles. You completely ruined my business reputation, Cameron. You destroyed my credit score. You are a complete fraud." Cameron shrank back, fresh tears spilling down his cheeks. He shook his head frantically, trying to formulate another lie, another excuse, but Jasmine gave him no quarter. She reached for her left hand. She gripped the massive, flawless diamond engagement ring and the matching platinum wedding band. She pulled them off her finger in one swift, aggressive motion. She stepped over to the mahogany bar where Cameron had left his drink. She held her hand over the expensive crystal glass filled with vintage champagne. She opened her fingers. The heavy diamond rings dropped, hitting the liquid with a soft splash, sinking straight to the bottom of the glass. "My lawyer will contact yours," Jasmine announced to the silent room. She turned back to Cameron, delivering her final crushing blow. "Oh wait, you cannot afford one." Jasmine did not wait for a response. She turned on her heel, grabbed her coat from the back of her chair, and walked out of the dining room. She kept her head held high, her posture flawless, striding past Kendra and the silent deputies without a single backward glance. The front door opened and closed with a definitive echoing thud. The sound of the closing door seemed to break the spell, holding the guests hostage. The terrifying reality of the situation crashed over the elite attendees. This was no longer just a dramatic family argument. This was an active crime scene. The patriarch was ruined. The son was facing felony charges. The daughter was the landlord. The entire Wilson dynasty was a toxic radioactive disaster. A mass chaotic exodus began. The judgmental extended family members and the wealthy corporate sycophants who had spent the last hour praising Richard began shuffling frantically toward the front door. They whispered furiously, avoiding the broken family at the center of the room, desperate to escape the suffocating humiliation permanently infecting the Westchester estate. The glittering facade of the mighty Wilson family was entirely destroyed, leaving nothing but shattered glass, forged documents, and a kneeling, weeping coward on the floor. The front double doors finally clicked shut for the very last time. The heavy silence rushed back into the grand dining room, settling over the wreckage like a thick, suffocating blanket of dust. The 20 guests had evaporated into the freezing Westchester rain, their expensive luxury cars tearing down the long asphalt driveway in a frantic, desperate race to escape the Wilson family meltdown. They left behind half-eaten charcuterie, abandoned champagne flutes, and the overwhelming, undeniable stench of ruined reputations. Only a small handful of people remained in the cavernous space. Kendra stood at the head of the massive mahogany table, an absolute monolith of control. David remained stationed at her right side, meticulously sliding the forged loan documents back into his sleek leather briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut with a sharp final click. The two county sheriffs stood by the arched entryway, their hands resting comfortably on their duty belts, watching the domestic implosion with the detached vigilance of seasoned law enforcement officers. And then there were the ruined Wilsons. Cameron was still curled tightly on the expensive Persian rug, his custom-tailored dress shirt wrinkled and damp with cold sweat and pathetic tears. He was rocking back and forth, muttering incoherent pleas to a bank that was already actively drafting his arrest warrant. Richard stood nearby, completely immobilized. He stared at the empty dining chairs where his highly influential neighbors had sat just moments before. His chest heaved with shallow, erratic breaths. His identity entirely built on the false perception of endless wealth and untouchable power had just been publicly and permanently executed. He had absolutely nothing left to say. Beatrice realized the silence in the room was permanent. There was no wealthy hedge fund manager coming back through the front door to save them. There was no brilliant corporate loophole waiting to be exploited. The terrifying reality of the $15,000 lease and the strict 48-hour eviction notice finally crashed completely through her thick, stubborn armor of denial. The arrogant, untouchable matriarch vanished in the blink of an eye. In her place, a primal, suffocating terror took root deep within her chest. She looked at her ruined, weeping son on the floor, then at her broken, silent husband, and finally at the daughter she had systematically discarded and ignored for 30 years. Beatrice's raw survival instinct kicked in instantly, completely overriding decades of casual cruelty and maternal neglect. She moved. She practically scrambled across the room, her heavy emerald silk gown slipping dangerously on the spilled champagne, completely disregarding her ruined designer heels. She reached Kendra and threw her entire body forward. Beatrice dropped heavily to her knees. The harsh, ugly impact of bone against the polished hardwood floor echoed loudly in the silent dining room. She reached up with desperate, trembling hands and grabbed the fine wool of Kendra's tailored overcoat, clutching the dark fabric as if it were a life raft in a churning, violent ocean. Kendra Beatrice wept, her voice high and breathless, entirely stripping away every single ounce of her refined, cultivated country club accent. Kendra, my beautiful, successful girl. Kendra did not flinch. She did not pull away from the frantic grasping. She stood perfectly still, her posture rigid, looking down at the weeping woman who had spent an entire lifetime making her feel utterly invisible and thoroughly worthless. "I always knew you were special," Beatrice sobbed loudly, her manicured fingers digging desperately into the charcoal fabric of the coat. "I always told your father you had a brilliant, calculating mind. You are so rich now. You have done so incredibly well for yourself. We are so fiercely proud of you. You have surpassed all of our wildest expectations." David scoffed quietly from the sidelines, shaking his head at the blatant, sickening hypocrisy. But Kendra did not break her terrifying, emotionless stare. She simply watched her mother unravel. "You cannot do this!" Beatrice pleaded, hot tears completely ruining her immaculate, expensive makeup, leaving dark, ugly streaks of mascara running down her flushed cheeks. "You cannot throw your own mother onto the street." Where will we possibly go? We have absolutely no liquid assets left. The bank froze all the corporate and personal accounts yesterday morning. We have absolutely nothing to our names. You have millions of dollars. You own the entire holding company. You can easily make this terrible misunderstanding go away with a single phone call. Please just talk to the authorities. Beatrice yanked frantically on the heavy wool coat, her voice escalating into a frantic high-pitched shriek that battered against the crystal chandeliers. Family forgives Kendra. We are blood. You cannot abandon your own flesh and blood in the freezing rain. You are a good, obedient girl. You are my daughter. You have to save us. Kendra looked down at her mother, searching her own heart for even a flicker of hesitation. She felt absolutely nothing. There was no residual childhood longing for maternal affection. There was no buried sympathy for the weeping, ruined woman destroying her silk gown on the wet hardwood floor. There was only the cold, hard, calculating clarity of a ledger finally balancing out to zero. Kendra reached down. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely devoid of hesitation. She gripped her mother's trembling, desperate wrists. Her grip was ironclad and unyielding. She slowly peeled Beatrice's frantic fingers off her wool coat physically, forcing the older woman to release her tight hold. Kendra took a single definitive step back, permanently severing the physical connection between them. She looked directly into Beatrice's terrified, tear-filled, pleading eyes. She clearly remembered the freezing winter night on the patio. She remembered the casual, devastating cruelty, the dismissive wave of a manicured hand, the absolute unwavering certainty that her daughter was completely worthless. "I am just a burden," Beatrice Kendra said. Her voice was perfectly smooth, an exact chilling echo of the cruel words spoken on New Year's Eve, and burdens do not carry people. Beatrice lunged forward again, her manicured nails catching the fabric of Kendra's coat in a second desperate attempt to anchor herself to her daughter's newfound wealth. Kendra did not tolerate the intrusion. She firmly removed her mother's hands from her coat, pushing Beatrice's wrists away with a final, unyielding motion. Beatrice slumped back onto the wet floorboards, her emerald dress fully ruined, her aristocratic dignity entirely erased. "You have exactly 48 hours to vacate my property," Kendra stated. Her voice was devoid of any emotional fluctuation. It was a pure, sterile business directive. Take whatever fits in a moving truck. Clothes, personal electronics, photographs. The rest of the inventory, the furniture, the artwork, the silver, the vehicles in the garage belongs to Phoenix Horizon, LLC. Do not attempt to strip this house. I have a comprehensive video inventory from the appraisal, and my legal team will prosecute for theft. Beatrice let out a hollow, ragged gasp. She looked up at the crystal chandelier, the imported rugs, the antique sideboards she had spent decades curating to impress her socialite friends. All of it was gone. Her entire identity, wrapped up in the material accumulation of the Wilson estate, belonged to the daughter she had deemed worthless. Richard stepped forward. He forced his broad shoulders back, trying to summon the imposing, terrifying patriarch persona that had controlled their family dynamic for 3 decades. His face was mottled with red rage and deep purple veins. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at Kendra's face. He wanted to strike her. He wanted to command her to submit. But the 2 armed deputies standing near the arched entryway immediately shifted their weight, their hands resting closer to their utility belts, sending a very clear, silent warning. "You will burn in hell for what you are doing to your family," Richard spat. His voice was gravelly, scraping against the silent walls of the dining room. "You are an unnatural, vicious creature. We gave you life. We put a roof over your head, and you return to slaughter us. You will pay for this arrogance." Kendra did not flinch. She did not look away. She stepped closer to her father, closing the distance until she could see the broken, terrified little man hiding behind the bluster. "I was already in hell," Richard Kendra replied. Her voice dropped to a lethal, quiet register that commanded total obedience. "You built it for me. You laid every single brick with your constant comparisons. You stoked the fire with your endless petty criticisms. You locked the doors when you chose to finance Cameron's ridiculous lifestyle while making me beg for scraps. You created a nightmare and expected me to live in it quietly. Kendra gestured to the sprawling, opulent dining room around them. Now I own the deed to it. She turned her back on him. She did not offer a goodbye. She did not wish them well. She signaled to David. The sharp Manhattan lawyer nodded, clutching his leather briefcase tightly against his side. He looked at the ruined family one last time, his face a mask of professional detachment before falling into step right behind his formidable client. Kendra walked toward the grand entryway. Her designer heels clicked with the same steady, merciless rhythm that had announced her arrival. The two county sheriffs moved smoothly into formation, flanking her as she approached the heavy front doors. They functioned as her personal guard, an undeniable physical manifestation of her newly acquired power. Behind them, the dining room completely erupted. The momentary paralysis that had gripped Richard finally snapped. He turned his attention back to the primary source of their immediate criminal and financial ruin. "You stupid, worthless boy!" Richard screamed, his voice cracking with unchecked fury. The sound of a heavy, solid object, perhaps a dining chair, being violently kicked across the room, echoed through the hallway. "You stole my name! You stole my company! I will see you rot in a federal cell before I let you drag me down with you." Cameron's pitiful, high-pitched wailing escalated into a full-blown hysterical panic attack. "Dad, please. The bank lied to me. The brokers lied to me. It was not my fault." "Get up," Richard roared. "Get off my floor." Intertwined with the violent masculine screaming was the sound of Beatrice. She was not trying to break up the fight between her husband and her golden child. She was simply weeping, letting out long, sustained cries of pure, unadulterated despair. She mourned the loss of her status, the loss of her country club memberships, and the absolute destruction of her carefully manicured social facade. Kendra reached the grand entryway. She placed her hand on the cold brass handle of the heavy oak door. She paused for a fraction of a second. She felt the cool draft leaking through the weather stripping. She listened to the symphony of destruction playing out in the formal dining room. It was the exact sound of a toxic dynasty collapsing under the massive, crushing weight of its own arrogance and deceit. She pulled the heavy oak door open. The freezing Westchester rain was still falling in sheets, washing the expensive asphalt driveway clean. The cold wind hit her face, crisp and incredibly refreshing. Kendra and David walked out the front door, stepping out into the dark, stormy night. The armed deputies followed closely behind them, stepping over the threshold. As the last sheriff exited, he reached back and pulled the heavy oak doors shut. The solid wood slammed into the doorframe with a thunderous final boom. The thick walls of the sprawling mansion instantly muffled the chaotic sounds of Beatrice's wailing and Richard's screaming. The estate was locked down. The trap had been sprung. The eviction clock was officially ticking. Kendra stood under the covered portico, watching the rain hammer against her waiting town car. The driver jumped out, popping an umbrella to shield her from the freezing and torrential heavy downpour. Exactly 1 week later, the freezing rain had transformed into a thick, relentless blanket of heavy white snow. The pristine winter morning offered a sharp, blinding contrast to the dark, stormy night of the dinner party. Kendra sat in the back seat of her chauffeured SUV. It idled across the street from the Westchester mansion. The plush interior was perfectly climate-controlled, radiating a soothing warmth that isolated her from the biting chill outside. She held a steaming cup of coffee between her hands, savoring the rich aroma as she stared through the tinted privacy glass. The grand mahogany front doors of the mansion were propped wide open, exposing the empty, echoing foyer to the harsh winter elements. A cheap U-Haul truck sat awkwardly in the center of the expansive circular driveway. It was the ultimate, undeniable symbol of their financial ruin. Richard and Beatrice were currently struggling down the icy front steps. There were no professional movers in crisp uniforms or dedicated household staff rushing to assist them. The bank had frozen every single account, and the loyal staff had vanished the exact second the payroll checks bounced. Richard wore a heavy, outdated tweed coat that he had likely pulled from the back of a forgotten closet. His face was bright red from the freezing wind and the physical exertion. He was violently dragging a massive, heavy black contractor trash bag down the steps. The thin plastic caught on a jagged piece of decorative stone, ripping open and spilling a chaotic tangle of expensive silk ties and tailored dress shirts directly into the gray, slushy snow. Beatrice trailed behind him, looking utterly unrecognizable. Her signature immaculate hairstyle was flattened by the relentless wind. She wore a bulky, shapeless parka over a pair of simple, dark trousers. She was attempting to carry two heavy cardboard boxes simultaneously, her arms trembling under the significant weight. Richard did not stop to help her. He simply threw the torn trash bag into the back of the rental truck and turned around to yell something at his wife, aggressively pointing his finger back toward the open doorway. Beatrice screamed something back, her face contorted in a mask of bitter, exhausted rage. The aristocratic elegance they had spent their entire lives cultivating had completely evaporated, leaving behind two bitter, broken people fighting over scraps in the freezing snow. Cameron was conspicuously absent from the miserable packing effort. His pristine luxury sports car was missing from the open garage. The golden child was currently sitting in a sterile, brightly lit holding cell in a federal detention center in Manhattan. The bank investigators had acted with terrifying speed once they received the undeniable proof of the forged loan documents. He had been arrested at a cheap motel 2 days ago, denied bail due to the massive flight risk and the staggering financial magnitude of his fraudulent activities. Jasmine had already filed the divorce papers and publicly severed all ties, leaving him to face the full unmitigated wrath of the justice system entirely alone. Kendra slowly shifted her gaze away from her struggling parents and focused on the manicured front lawn. Standing proudly at the edge of the property line, planted firmly into the frozen ground, was a massive wooden sign. The bold navy blue letters read "For Sale," followed by the words "Exclusive Listing." The massive estate no longer belonged to the Wilson family. It belonged to Phoenix Horizon LLC, and it was about to be liquidated to the highest bidder. The quiet, sophisticated hum of her smartphone vibrating against the leather seat broke the silence inside the SUV. Kendra picked it up and tapped the screen to answer the call. "Good morning, David," Kendra said, her voice smooth and entirely relaxed. "Good morning, Kendra," the sharp Manhattan lawyer replied, his tone radiating professional satisfaction. "I am calling with the final updates. The real estate brokers have officially finalized the listing portfolio. The house hits the market tomorrow. We already have 3 international buyers expressing serious interest in an immediate cash transaction." "Excellent work," David Kendra replied, taking a slow, satisfying sip of her hot coffee. "And the situation with Cameron, completely handled," David confirmed. "The forged loan evidence has been handed over to the DA. The prosecutors are ecstatic. It is a completely airtight case. They are anticipating a minimum sentence of 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Your involvement is entirely concluded. You are completely free." A profound, expansive sense of peace washed over Kendra. For 30 years she had carried the suffocating weight of their expectations, their cruel dismissals, and their endless demands. She had allowed them to dictate her worth and diminish her achievements. Now, looking at the spectacular wreckage of their own making, the cage door swung wide open. The heavy chains of familial obligation were permanently shattered. "Thank you, David," Kendra said softly. "I will see you at the board meeting on Monday." She ended the call and slipped the phone into her designer handbag. Outside, Richard slammed the heavy metal roll-up door of the U-Haul truck shut. He walked around to the driver's side and climbed in. Beatrice struggled into the passenger seat, slamming her door with equal ferocity. Kendra watched without a single ounce of pity as the cheap rental truck sputtered to life and rolled down the asphalt driveway, completely bypassing the massive real estate sign. They drove away completely stripped of their fake wealth, their precious golden child, and their blinding, foolish pride. Kendra leaned forward and tapped the glass partition separating her from the driver. "Take me to the office," Kendra instructed, her voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority. "We have a new empire to run." Her phone suddenly vibrated in her hand. It was an automated bank alert confirming a massive offshore transfer. Her personal wealth had just multiplied, securing her absolute dominance. The sleek luxury SUV pulled away into the bright, crisp New York morning, leaving the past behind forever. Kendra's journey teaches us a devastating but liberating truth. The family you are born into does not dictate your ultimate value, nor do they automatically deserve a front row seat to your success. For decades, Kendra was the designated scapegoat, forced to live in the suffocating shadow of a golden child whose perceived perfection was actually built on a fragile foundation of lies, entitlement, and eventual fraud. Her story is a powerful reminder that trying to earn the love of those who are stubbornly committed to misunderstanding you is a battle you will never win. True empowerment comes from stepping completely out of that toxic cycle, quietly laying your own bricks, and securing your absolute financial and emotional independence. We frequently confuse familial obligation with emotional captivity. Toxic individuals often believe that blood ties grant them a lifetime pass for cruelty, only weaponizing the concept of family when their own house of cards collapses. Kendra's unwavering refusal to play the dutiful, self-sacrificing savior highlights a profound, life-altering boundary. You are under no obligation to set yourself on fire simply to keep your abusers warm. Walking away is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of profound self-preservation. When you finally stop seeking validation from people who are deeply invested in your smallness, you free yourself to build an empire of your own. Have you ever been treated as the black sheep of your family, only to realize that your independence was actually your greatest superpower? How did you finally find the courage to walk away from toxic expectations, cut the emotional cords, and build your own definition of success? Share your journey in the comments below. Your survival story might be the exact inspiration another woman needs today to finally break free. If Kendra's ultimate triumph resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more empowering stories of women taking back their control. Remember, your worth is never determined by those who are too blind to see it.